So I have the pleasure of introducing our second panel on freedom and death, and our first presenter is Bryan Brentus Green. Bryan is a political scientist working in the subfields of American political development, Black and racial politics, and he's an assistant professor of political science at James Madison University. His ongoing research examines the political development of criminal legal institutions, their democratic consequences, and their effects on public safety outcomes. A lifelong science fiction fan, Dr. Green is wholly enamored by space operas, including Star Wars, Star Trek, Dune, and The Man Who Fell to Earth, which combines his love of space travel and soap operas, such as The Bold and the Beautiful, The Young and the Restless, the latter gifted by his grandmother. His leading interests include Afrofuturism, and he often uses science fiction media and literature to teach racial and ethnic politics. Dr. Green, what is yours?
Thank you guys for having me. Shout out Ed Green for making me watch soap operas with her. When the idea of this conference came together around Andor, excuse me, my first initial thought was like, oh, they're constantly sort of like teaching each other. Right?
Can you make mic up a little bit?
Sorry. Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay. So my first initial thought was around, oh, they're constantly sort of having these quiet moments that are more than encouragement. They're having these quiet moments of like teaching each other, right? So I started thinking about Andor in relation to the idea of freedom schools. In doing so, I found this archive connected to the College of Charleston about freedom school, or rather about 100 Black revolutionaries during the mid-20th century who used freedom schools as a mechanism for advancing social justice or advancing the civil rights movement. So this is me exploring that archive for a project in the distant future that I will eventually get to. But using this opportunity to end our series to begin thinking about sort of lessons of revolution and freedom, but specifically thinking about, again, freedom schools not as the formal institutions that they sometimes are. We can think about historical Black colleges and universities as really as a series of freedom schools, or even the physical infrastructure of informal freedom school education, as we're going to talk a little bit about here. But freedom schools that's sort of like just these sort of informal moments of interaction and instruction and lessons between two or more people who are gathered for the purpose of resisting authoritarian regimes. So with that, I'm thinking a little bit about social movement theory here. I'm thinking a lot about McAdams' cognitive liberation in this context. I'm thinking a lot about people Woodley's work on political swelling. Swelling is a forestry term. Swelling describes burning a landscape in a forest or some other wooded area for the purposes of creating and generating new growth. Really uses that analogy to think about social movements as a political swelling, social movements as a mode of political swelling within sort of dying or struggling democracies. But I'm interested in this from the perspective of the most marginalized people, right? What Cohen would describe as advanced marginalization, not just Black, but Black and poor, Black and queer, filling all your blanks, right? So what is the process of motivating cognitive liberation amongst the most marginalized? And what are these freedom schools in the mid-20th century, places poor as John's Island in South Carolina, what lessons do they have for motivating sort of cognitive liberation, again, amongst the most marginalized persons and citizens struggling under authoritarian regimes? So for framework, thinking about Mickey's work, thinking about the South as a series of subnational authoritarian enclaves under an otherwise democratic system. I love the book. We can actually have some questions, and we can sort of question that idea. The freedom schools that we're talking about on John's Island are products of the progressive, products of the Highlander School in Tennessee. There was a civil rights movement founded by Miles Fortin and others. So all of the actors that I'm going to reference today studied under that school, and they used the lessons of those schools to produce their a whole range of civil rights mobilizations in South Carolina. But the freedom schools in particular of Johns Island actually became the basis for the liberation education of the SCLC and then eventually directly SNCC. So this was this little spot, this little tiny alley, not really tiny, this little spot of land in South Carolina actually sort of produced the mechanisms for teaching liberation really globally, not globally directly, but really across the country as part of the broader civil rights movement towards the end of the 1950s and 1960s. I'm going to focus my work here on Bernice Robinson. In thinking about this work, I really became fascinated with her story. If you know any of the names that I mentioned before, you probably recognize Septima Clark. She was the most credentialed of the three. Esau Jackson was sort of the most active activist on the ground in that area, but he didn't produce a lot of written work. Bernice Robinson, who also doesn't have the credentials of a Septima Clark, and was also active in that area, actually produced a fair amount of written work that ends up in her archives. And she sort of takes the role of this sort of Gramscian organic intellectual, right? This is a woman with no sort of formal political training. This is a woman who never even anticipated or didn't even want the job, sort of the freedom school educator that she became, but who, again, produces the kind of networks, produces the theory, produces the basic practices of freedom school development that becomes the foundation for how schools look throughout the civil rights movement in that area. So I'm drawing from two primary sources. They're both speeches. The 1972 speech is a speech that she gives around her district, around Charleston County rather, as she's running for the South Carolina State House in 1972. The same year that Shirley Chisholm becomes the first Black woman to run for president, Bernice Robinson becomes the first Black woman in South Carolina to run for office, period. And then towards the end of her life, she gives a speech at the University of California at Santa Cruz, talking about the movement overall, and sort of describing sort of the processes and the rationales that they made as they were sort of making decisions about how to develop the school, how to improve the school, and how to engage with students, so on and so forth. Okay. So let's take I have 5 lessons that I want to draw from this work and sort of using them to begin thinking about theory development generally, like how should we understand the work of these actors, again, working with amongst the poorest Black South Carolinians in the mid-20th. Right? There are 5 lessons, and this is the first, right? This is a couple of biblical references here. I'm talking about folks in the Bible Belt. And we're in Alabama. Where 2 or more gathered, right? So the idea that you don't actually need to have a full sort of space, you don't actually need to sort of organize these full classrooms. The idea of a freedom school can sort of move wherever these people are, and where they are, the freedom school exists, right? All of those exchanges, formal and informal, are really important to advancing this work. In the example here, Esau Jenkins was one of the seminal figures. Owned a whole bunch of like small companies. He had a store, he had a busing company. I'm almost certain that my grandfather used his buses to get back and forth to work. But as a product of that, he was training people how to register to vote, how to beat the literacy test in South Carolina as he was bringing them back and forth from work. So he was helping them to memorize the part of the Constitution that they would have to recite or they would have to read while they were registering to vote, right? Again, he's working with a group of very poor South Carolinians. Most of these people can't read. Most of these people were blocked from formal education, or they exited into the workforce very soon. So he's using all of these, he's using every opportunity possible to introduce this sort of education in order to advance political liberation, political mobilization. And I love the story of the woman who just memorizes the whole thing. And even in memorizing the whole thing, then trains other people how to beat the test themselves, right? In this scenario, you have people that call it a bus. It's really just a big band who are like captured. They're a captured audience. And he says, we're going to take this time as I'm giving you to work to also fight back against white supremacy in this system, right? The parallel that I see in Andor really comes from the opening scenes in both seasons, right? On the right, we have the scene where Andor is in Morlana Prime. He's looking for his sister, and he's engaging, I guess the hostess would be her title. And the hostess comes up to him when he enters when he enters the room. The hostess comes up to him, begins to engage. They obviously know why he's there. And the security guards that you see here on the left balk at the fact that the hostess entertains him before entertaining them, right? And she sort of, brushes them off. But he says, hey, this is a company town, right? And in that moment, he's giving the instruction of like, hey, I understand that you don't actually care about their feelings, but in order to sort of continue to exist under their immediate scrutiny, go ahead and take care of them first, right? It's this really small moment of like, what I thought was a really powerful small moment of not really trading, right? But sort of like, it was more than just pushback or feedback, but it felt like instruction, right? Important that Andor is sort of like an experienced criminal, right? So he has some sense of how to navigate criminal legal systems. He has some sense of how to navigate places like these in discursive ways. And it's actually imparting an important lesson that when it is not taken leads to a whole series of events, including him sort of getting on the, finding himself on the radar. Oh gosh, I forgot his name. Dedra's boyfriend.
Cyril.
Thank you. This gets him on Cyril's radar, right? The fact that she doesn't sort of like think to take care of security first, despite the fact that she knows, and everybody knows these are ineffectual folks who aren't really like serious police officers, still take care of them. On the left there, we have the first scene from, or one of the first scenes from the second season, where Naya is in a moment of distress, right? Realizing that her life is over. And Andor is engaging her around sort of a whole host of things. I imagine that his primary motivation was to keep her calm enough that they could get the ship off, right? Get the TIE fighter off the planet. But also it's speaking about effectors, it's also this moment of sort of, she's giving, or rather, he's introducing her to the realities of rebellion and beyond the stated norms as practice are sort of sent down from the hierarchy, right? He's like, look at me, like we are in this together, right? And the thing that I think is particularly important here, that she knows how the precarious situation that she's in. She's very aware of the possibility of her demise. I think she even suspects that it's going to come. And the lesson that I think that he gives here that is really important is the importance of her cognitive liberation in and of itself being the win, right? That the idea of being able to survive the rebellion, finding on the other side is something that we may all want. But the idea that you broke away, right, from the ideas of the imperial order itself, that in itself is worth the death that might be coming, right? So again, these sort of small lessons where he's pushing folks forward in these moments of, here he's just trying to sort of in these moments of discord, in these moments of challenges, in very small ways, but still sort of form as his moments of instruction of the more experienced person speaking to a less experienced person and teaching them how to survive under an authoritarian regime in this particular way. Lesson number 2. Every opportunity is an opportunity to teach and learn, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about, from John's Island. Yes, I love this story, okay? So again, the context of this is 1957, South Carolina, right? And you have Bernice Robinson is teaching a class, and she has these illiterate Black adults and their literate children, right? Now, these illiterate Black adults spent time working in people's homes, working in fields, doing drudgery work, so that their children would have the opportunity to do something like learn how to read that they did not, right? The challenge here is more cultural than it is pragmatic. Does Robinson have a need to sort of quiet the children to keep control of the classroom? Absolutely, right? But what I find most interesting here that she doesn't really delve to in detail in the speech is the challenge that having children laughing at these adults might pose to those adults who are continuing to return to school, right? If my child can now mock me, that's a challenge. It's a particular challenge with these group of students because, again, under this advanced marginalization, these folks only really have a couple of places in where their authority is respected, right? The relationship between parent and child. In 1957, the relationships explicitly between husband and wife, right? I don't need to give you the history. And then in the church, right? Where their position as ministers, their positions as deacons, their position running the usher board, as an example, gives them a level of authority that they don't have in their everyday life. They're having their authority challenged in a serious way if their children can mock them. And I love this because it turns the teaching around in two ways. One, it gives the students an opportunity to learn themselves, right? But it also gives an opportunity for the children to teach their parents. The next step of their cognitive liberation beyond learning how to read is learning how to articulate ideas in public, right? So the children are sort of marching on a new step, on their way to learning a new skill that the parents themselves, as part of their civil rights activism, is going to have to learn and exercise as a means of advancing the civil rights movement forward, right? It's a brilliant moment of sort of classroom management just as a teacher, but it's also a brilliant moment of civil rights activism, but also sort of uses as a means of sort of advancing the movement in a very small way, right? There's a scenario where Robinson just sends the children outside, right? But by bringing them into the space and making them active, she actually expands the opportunities and the community that can be a part of the organization that's happening here around the Progressive Club. In Andor, we see this in a couple of ways, right? On the left here is one of my favorite scenes from the second series where like, what do you do when what you expected to be there is not the thing that's there, right? And your life is on the line. The thing you do is learn how to use the thing that's not there, right? So even though it was what would be a terrifying, precarious situation for anybody, scared the shit out of me. It's an opportunity to learn, right? And they have access to new technology that they weren't expecting to get access to. He learns how to fly a new ship that he wasn't expecting, kind of learns how to fly a new ship. He learns how to fly a new ship when he needs to move an area forward. As a part of this, right? So even though it becomes a precarious situation, it actually turns into an opportunity that he's able to take advantage of. On the right, had they survived, right, this would have been a really important learning lesson for this group of rebels, right? Because at some point he says it's not going to rain forever, and it's this moment of like, hey, you also have to think about your survival in addition to thinking about how you're going to deal with the civil war that's now come between these two factions, the factions rather that are now fighting within this rebel. Right, and there's little lessons like that he gives throughout his moment, this period that he's captured. I forgot the name of him, but throughout the period that he's captured by this group, just sort of small like things that he should be doing. I think he's doing that for two reasons. The primary reason is to distract him and sort of try to figure out a way to sort of escape himself, right? But the other thing that I think he caught, again, at this point of his career as a rebel, the other thing that I think that he understands is that if they survive, he's going to need them, right? So it's building agency with them if they're able to come together at a different period. And it's also building an opportunity, preparing a rebel group that even if he doesn't interact with them directly, they have a new set of skills and to think about the sort of the ways in which they are engaged in situations like these moving forward. So again, small moments, right? These aren't formal instructional periods, but it is a sort of a freedom school sort of pushing forward the narrative, pushing forward the rebellion in tiny ways, tiny but important ways. Lesson number 3. This is where I think the lessons from John's Alley diverge from some of the lessons that we hear at Andy, right? And for the activists in John Allen, collaboration was essential, right? These were not hierarchical folks. They were not building top-down institutions. They wanted a collaborative learning experience. They wanted a collaborative liberation experience. Even more so than the desires of sort of the mainstays of the civil rights movement. There's a lot of evidence from a whole set of archives that Martin King, why am I blanking on names? Ralph Abernathy, and a lot of the other male leaders of the civil rights movement really looked down and stepped up to Martin Brentus Robinson in particular, despite the fact that they were contributing so much to the movement, right? So the absence of a pure hierarchy in the Johns Island example is really aberrational within the civil rights movement overall, right? Or Black liberation struggles throughout this period overall. They're operating in the there's a level of Black feminism to it that I just thought that we need to explore that's happening here, that isn't happening within the movement more generally. And this is a beautiful moment where Bernice Robinson is not a trained teacher. She's not, she didn't really want to teach the class. She was actually quite adamant against it, and we'll get there in a second. But she says, because I don't really know what I'm doing, I'm just going to kind of concede that, right? And hey, there are things that I'm going to learn from. In fact, I'm going to learn more from you than you're going to learn from me, right? Again, giving these people who are experiencing a level of advanced marginalization, a level of agency that they probably don't have in their, that they definitely don't have in their everyday lives, right? To come back to Andor, they don't quite get this right, right? There are a lot of examples of this. We're going to focus on this scene. When Cinta and Bell get to Gorman to help the rebels prepare to take their action, their presentation is, you don't know anything, right? I am the leader here. You need to listen to what I say. This is not a collaborative process. And then for the next 3 minutes, they show a collaborative process in action. Right? They're asking the rebels information that they don't have. Do we have control of these rooftops? Are there going to be guards here? And a whole host of other things that they don't know about the plan because it's not their plan. So despite the fact that they do engage in a collaborative process, their presentation is a top-down hierarchical sort of situation, right? A clear departure, at least in rhetoric, from the Johns Island example, despite the fact that their actions sort of reflect the example that we see in Johns Island itself, right? So there is a divorce here that's worth exploring. Okay. Lesson number 4. Anybody can teach, and sometimes the teacher needs to be you, right? Sometimes there is a particular voice at a particular moment that needs to be heard in order to move action forward. In the Johns Island example, coming back to Bernice Robinson, she was really the only person that was available to teach that class. Septima Clark, I think at the time, might have been in Philadelphia or back in Tennessee, engaged elsewhere. And nobody else had the combination of relationship with the community and knowledge of the Highland Center process in order to sort of make the class very successful. But again, as she's developing this process for a national campaign, she takes it seriously that anybody can actually do this work, right? Again, she doesn't have a post-secondary education. She's not she's an a professional in the sense that she's an entrepreneur, but she's not a white-collar professional, right? And when they start to engage people around sort of reproducing these projects in other places, they pull literally everybody, right? And one of the first persons that she ends up teaching is Hosea Williams, who becomes the confidant of Martin Luther King, becomes his literal right-hand man sort of throughout the rest of the civil rights movement up until his death, right? So again, this organic intellectual without any particular training, using this opportunity to so on and so forth. In the Andor example, why did I forget his name? Thank you. Tino was the kind of classic example. Thank you. He has no desire to do this work, right? He is, and until the moment that he realizes he is never getting out of this place, he refuses to do it, right? It is pure personal necessity that drives him to it. But once he gets there, he's the only person that can communicate this message. Andor doesn't have a relationship with these people. He's only been there like 9 or 10 months. He's been there for years. He has to be the voice in that moment to make the other prisoners believe that this opportunity is actually there, and if they take it right now, liberation is possible. Quickly, the last lesson, you have to meet people where they are, right? Whatever that means, right? Here's a picture of the store that Esau Jenkins owned, and this was a major place of mobilization, a major place of political education throughout this movement in Johns Island. Bernice Robinson talks about these people wanted to learn to read, but not necessarily for the purpose of learning to vote. They needed to do very practical things like write a money order. They needed to be able to read letters from their family. They needed to be able to write letters. They needed to be able to read the labels of the groceries they were purchasing, right? So she uses that opportunity of teaching them how to do the very practical things that they need to do within their lives, and then to feed that into the political movement, right? Now that you know how to read your grocery label, here's how you read a ballot. Here's how you read this section of the Constitution. Here's how you read a law, so on and so forth, right? It's connecting people's literal needs, people's material needs, and connecting that to the movement in a way that you get to. I'm running out of time. I see the parallel in the ways in which Lutheran Rail talks about the Gorman Massacre, right? We can maybe look at this as sort of like Luther being more interested in producing the kind of political mobilization that he wants in that moment, regardless of what the Gormans actually want. But we could also look at it as a sense of like, hey, if they're willing to sacrifice their lives, who are we to tell them no, right? That's where they were. That's when they got there. That's the politics of the moment, right? I think that's all I have.
So our next speaker on panel 2 is Sarah Parkinson, who is the Aronson Associate Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Her research examines organizational behavior and social change in war and disaster affected settings, with a focus on Southwest Asia and North Africa. Parkinson has published award-winning research on militant organizations' decision-making and internal dynamics, the politics of disaster and humanitarian crisis, and research methods. A passionate advocate of the machete order, the proper way to watch or not watch Star Wars movies. She proudly counts how to watch Star Wars like an insurgent in the Washington Post, and Andor is a lesson building in rebellion and foreign policy among her contributions to public discourse. Dr. Parkinson, floor is yours. Juggling so many things. Great. Okay. So thank you so much for that introduction. And the topic of this extremely fledgling paper is Grief and Grievance, which for those of you not immersed in this literature and political science, hopefully all of you may well be, shielded from this. It's a play on a paper called Greed and Grievance that is basically testing hypotheses about do people rebel because they're greedy and want money and they're going to materially benefit from rebelling, or do grievances drive rebellion? And one of the reasons that I chose this is specifically because of the dichotomy presented. And one of the things that I want to do today is actually break down a bunch of dichotomies that tend to exist in this literature. And just as a little bit of framing, there are two pieces of framing that I want to lay out there before I get into this particular discussion. One is that I am a scholar of Southwest Asia, and that my work on militant organizations, on crisis, on disaster has been shaped inevitably by the fact that, all of this scholarship took place in the post-2001 era, then in the 2011 era of the Arab uprisings and the civil wars that followed from many of those, and the post-2023 era of the genocide in Gaza. And that seeing some of the shifts in public discourse, but also seeing the stickiness
of many of the narratives that have been associated with all of those moments is something that I want to pull through at the end of this particular presentation. It's also, and I alluded to this on on the earlier panel, somewhat of a reaction to what I would almost call an overthinking of emotion in politics in the academy, where it's like, okay, how can we test out if it's greed and grievance? Are people really angry about being occupied? And it's like, is that really a question that you are asking? The number of times I've seen someone have like a wake up face after I say like people don't like being occupied is sort of extraordinary, right? But I actually came to this particular paper and thinking about this conversation when I was sort of trying to unknot some of the ways we think about emotion in rebellion, in political violence more broadly, and the way that different emotions are indexed in various sci-fi series, et cetera, was to think about the planet destroyers. And they show up in a bunch of different places, right? So they show up in The Expanse, they show up in Star Trek, they obviously show up in Star Wars, we'll get to that, don't worry, and in Battlestar Galactica. And what we see is sort of a very typical presentation of the way violence is portrayed, I would argue, both in science fiction and in the US and European media, right? This idea that this level of violence is evil, is atavistic, is extremist, it's rageful. What becomes really interesting to me in all three of these examples that audiences are also given a motivation. Okay, so the Cylons were created by humans and repressed systematically. There's a war, they go into exile, and then they come back and attack default colonies and commit what is genocide, right? And spur a nuclear winter, right? Margo Inaros is part of a fringe faction of various Belter resistance groups, and the Belters have been subject to systematic marginalization, injustice, et cetera, et cetera. Inaros is on the fringe, and he's portrayed as being on the fringe, especially when he's, hurling asteroids at Earth. But he's not portrayed as just an angry guy, right? Nero in the reboot of Star Trek destroys, is Romulan. I don't know the Star Trek lore as well. Please don't hate on me online. But he's basically angry because in the destruction of Romulus, his home planet, his pregnant wife died, right? So these are seen as obviously inappropriate responses, extreme responses, and they're undercut by extremist ideologies, but they're also motivated. So Star Wars is really interesting because in 1977, it presents audiences, again, with this idea of full planetary destruction. I do think that it is interesting when it comes to thinking about the legacies of war, that audiences, and these are all obviously American series, that audiences need planetary destruction to get at the idea of how bad war is. Mm-hmm. And it has to be like the kineticness and the time frame for planetary destruction, its planet has to blow up. The Cylons, you get the sort of nuclear attack, nuclear winter situation, but everyone has to evacuate right away. There's no slow violence in these stories. And what you see in Star Wars with the Death Star specifically in 77 is you see what is fundamentally a galactic government that until this moment, at this moment is when the last representative body is being dissolved, right? Leia is told on the Death Star as they're looking out the window that she is no longer a senator because the Senate has been dissolved. But what we're seeing here is a galactic governing system or a system of government that has become so authoritarian, so corrupt, so evil that it will destroy a planet to achieve total control, or in an attempt to achieve total control. But a bunch of things have to happen first, including the destruction of representative authority. This is fundamentally distinct from what we see with the Cylons, with Nero, and with Marco Inaros. But what we also see here, and it's important to note here that, Star Wars obviously predates those series. I do think that it's intriguing that we get those through the warning of this government, and then you obviously see what happens in Jeddah and Scarif, and then in Rogue One, is that we also see a very visceral portrayal of grief. And I actually replayed this scene maybe like 6 times as I was writing this section of the paper, looking at the physicality of grief that Obi-Wan Kenobi embodies, right? And the line is, of course, famous. I felt a great disturbance in the force as if millions of voices suddenly cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced. And what's interesting to me is that this becomes this long motivation, both in A New Hope, and then it lasts into A Return of the Jedi. And then if you want to go for the sequels as well, the fear, but also the grief of what happened in Alderaan. And you see all kinds of like fan production around it. Remember Alderaan in the lore. If you want to spend hours on Wikipedia, you can sort of delve into the way that this becomes a source of rebel propaganda. Yeah. So very quickly, what I'm going to try to do over the course of like 4 sections of the paper is to think about what it means to sort of simplify political emotion down. And I do think that this is sometimes a pathology of political science in trying to be like, it's this one thing. Trying to simplify political action into anger, into being sort of fed by anger. That's not to say anger is not a part of it. I think anger is a huge part of it. But I want to make a point about what it means to actually exclude a bunch of other emotions simultaneously. To think about what bringing in different emotions, particularly grief, and using grief as an index, what we can get out of the complexity of political emotion and how it's performed. And I want to get at sort of a gender distinction in Star Wars that actually, I think, tells us something both about the texts of Star Wars and about sort of larger American understandings of what militancy is, what rebellion is, what insurgency is, and to get at some of what I think are some pretty powerful blind spots. For the political scientists in the room, I'm going to spend no time on this. But what I want to get at is simply that there's a good deal of theorizing out there, and we see a lot of like, okay, why do people mobilize? Why do people rebel? And we can see, if anyone's ever sort of seen the emotion wheel, these fit into 2 categories of the emotion wheel, right? They're very direct, they're very sort of kinetic emotions, fear, anger, resentment, et cetera, et cetera. What I want to get at in terms of grief in Star Wars is to think about manageable versus unmanageable emotions, to think about appropriate versus inappropriate responses and emotional responses, and also individual versus collective emotion. And this is actually something I came up with in the like during the previous panel, and sort of thinking through how various characters are represented to be enacting their own emotions and their own grief versus as sort of representatives of a larger collective. Okay. So I sort of start with personal grief, and so what I'll do is I'll sort of talk about selections of characters and how they portray emotion. I sort of talk about Cassian, Wilman, Jin, and Luke, and I should, have the 2x2, but I'm not a good political scientist, so I don't. But thinking about how people some of the characters come to their politics through grief and through the loss, specifically of a family member or choice of family. Okay. And I argue that that's actually a very, very identifiable form of grief, and that actually, I was set up very generously for this one. That is the grief that we associate with anger. Like, you killed my father, you deserve to die. Or now you die, or what.
Prepare to die.
Prepare to die. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I have to thank Seth Maskett for this because we've been going back and forth on Leia and the fact that we never see Leia.
Mhm.
Okay. And I'll get to the sort of quotes that index this. But when we think about women identified characters such as Belle, Leia, and Mon Mothma, and I'm going to get to non-human characters at the end of this because I think that's incredibly important too. So like we're getting to Chewbacca, don't worry. But what I want to argue is that Star Wars explanations of grief mirror, challenge, and reveal blank spots in American conceptions of loss and mourning and war. And that those are political reverberations, and they also hold a mirror up to us. And probably have a lot, reflect a lot of short-sightedness, I would argue. But sort of the kicker line that I came up with last night was reducing people to their anger is an attempt to flatten and individualize their political behavior, rather than understanding it as one aspect of their multi-layered collective experiences of injustice and loss. And shout out to Kanisha Bond for workshopping that a little with me. I do want to say that I'm thinking about grief as a residue of lived experience. This is how Roger Peterson defines emotions in some of his work. And I want to distinguish it from the biomedical concept of trauma. All right, I want to make that distinction between lived experience and the biomedical experience of trauma. So the characters who I think are really identifiable to us and relatable in many ways, and also centered in the Star Wars universe. Wilman, Luke Skywalker, so this is from when Obi-Wan dies in battle, and Cassian Andor. And a couple of things going on. We see Wilman making the pipe bomb in direct reaction to his father dying, right? Or not dying, being executed, right? Luke is watching Obi-Wan die at the hands of a human who at that point, he sees as evil, right? There's an injustice, and he's just coming into politics at this point, and it becomes sort of transformative. And Cassian Andor is coming off of actually an incredible sort of legacy of injustice, right? He has lost his entire family, he has lost his planet. This is taken from the Rick's Road episode. I was actually looking for a picture when he's touching his father's brick. And it was interesting what I could get screenshots of and what I couldn't. So I could actually get the tear with Wilman, but I couldn't find the brick, for example. So what am I arguing here? Part is that what we get with each of these characters is we get the grief to anger connection. There's an individualized sort of line here. And we also actually get differing portrayals of very individualized, but like appropriate versus inappropriate anger, or actions that are accompanying their grief that actually show that they're grieving to a certain degree. So Cassian actually, prior to when we see him, he's a criminal. He is so angry and so not dealing with his grief that he messes up his original relationship with Bix, right? That comes out in Andor. Luke, as I sort of mentioned in the last session, is frustrated early on when we see him first on Tatooine, and he's kind of whiny. And he's a really hard student to teach for Yoda, right? And he's dealing with a lot. I think that Wilman is actually really interesting because he's a total playboy, right? Which if you view it through a certain lens, and you understand it through different stages of grief and thinking through inappropriate behavior, like what he is doing is seeking connection in a very specific way, right? He has got a girl there before, right? He winds up sticking with Drina, but there's one everywhere he stops, all right? So thinking about how their actions are justified, we understand why they're angry, we understand why they're violent, but it's very individual, and we actually get both sides of the appropriate versus inappropriate, and we see the individual and the collective. Then we get to the women identified characters, and this is where I think things get really interesting across the registers. one, we're not connecting their grief with their political behavior. This is much more nuanced, it's more subtle, it's more complex, right? And if we're thinking through the lens of the existing theories of mobilization that we have in political science, we know they're angry, right? Leia sort of demonstrates anger. Vel certainly demonstrates anger, as does Mon Mothma. But I would argue that the way in which their grief or lack thereof is subtly indexed actually gets at the collective and gets at what we're missing in sort of our understanding of how, or, you know, and I say as people situated in the US, right? I think that plenty of people understand this in different ways. What I'm talking about is like the US foreign policy establishment, or what the US media chooses to represent, or even how Star Wars foregrounds male grief and anger in very particular ways, and then has Leia saying, as she is getting off the Millennium Falcon on Yavin 4, says, we have no time for our sorrows. And that's sort of a theme that we see throughout, right? So that's her there. Vel is a really interesting character because we see her actively grieving first at Mon Mothma's daughter, I've forgotten the daughter's name. Who can hit the daughter's name off the top of their head? How good are we in here? Okay, I feel bad. So Vel is actually deeply upset at this wedding, and what she is grieving is the relationship she does not get to have, both because Cinta has told her that the rebellion comes first, and that is a loss for her, and this is about what people sacrifice more deeply, but also because she is from this extraordinarily conservative society that would not even recognize that relationship in the first place. And by the end of the wedding, she is curled up in a window on the courtyard, basically shattered, right? And she is in all of this Chandrilan finery and is just absolutely alone, right? And that sort of loneliness you see with Leia, you see with Vel, and you see with Mothma, right? By the time we get to Mothma at the wedding as well, the wedding becomes this extraordinarily important point. But actually, I want to go back to Vel for a second, because then you have the moment when Cinta dies, when she's actually finally gotten access where the relationship might actually exist in a realm of balance, and where Sam's mistake, right? Sam's screw up in carrying a weapon, which Vel specifically told him not to do, and perhaps because she was so harsh about it, he did the like dude thing where he's like, I'm going to do it anyway, right? She loses her partner and the one person she can actually exist in at least this world with. Right? And she tells him, you are going to wear this like skin. But she never really recovers, right? She has trouble toasting Cinta at the end of the series, right? And when we think about all that represents, right? Like, yes, it's a personal loss. She didn't get into this because of that personal loss. She has to stay in this in spite of that personal loss. So Mothma, much has been made of the wedding scene. But what I think is really important here is that this is really the moment when Mothma goes from like, she doesn't really have to know what Luthen is saying, to she is now a being of the rebellion. This is the last time she gets to exist in this space. This is the last time she gets to say, I'm living in both worlds somehow. Like the balance is gone after this. And those are choices she makes, but this is one that isn't entirely made for her. Luthen pushes her and says that to protect you, you have to make this choice. And it's worth noting that this is also the scenes from the wedding. She gets progressively drunker. Her hair comes down. By the end of the wedding, she is literally a blur. She is lost and she is alone within a sea of people who are all there to celebrate her family. It's also interspersed with scenes of Vix's sexual assault, which I think is very much worth thinking about. So really quickly, as I was writing this, an episode of the Ezra Klein show came out, which was Mark Lynch and Shibli Telhami speaking with Ezra Klein. And Klein actually reproduces parts of the argument that I was making in the beginning, right? That the reason to worry about killing people overseas is like, they have long memories. They're going to come back and get revenge. They're coming for us. That anger means that we're coming for us. And that is, of course, deeply gendered and racialized. And I would be remiss if I didn't call out Maya Mikdashi's work here, which she's been incredibly influential here, as well as Helen Kinselis. Right, he basically says like, we need to understand this, that people have long memories. And here's the thing, he's not wrong, but Lynch actually does a really good job of saying like the fundamental problem here is dehumanization. That you are refusing to see the complexity, that you are seeing just the dead father in that direct line from grief to anger, and not seeing the people who are separated from their communities, whose communities, if I go to the next slide, and we think about some of the characters in Star Wars Rebels or in the initial trilogy, so Kashyyyk, the genocide on Kashyyyk, thinking about all of the characters who are represented as the last of their kind, right? Klein is focusing on the angry man. And what I think that Andor actually asks us to see is all of the experiences of the women, of the non-human characters who are represented as dealing with all of these different layers of grief, and where it doesn't just lead to anger, it leads to all kinds of different things. And by isolating away anger, we're actually not adequately recognizing not just what the anger is, but we're not, that there's actually something that is a loss to us. I think that Andor helps us point that out, but I also think that in then recentering that, like, I lost my father and I'm angry and grieving, we also see that sort of artifact of American society there, and that sort of inability to understand the deeper losses and all of the ways in which they shape politics. I'm done. Thank you.
Good. 15 minutes for questions.
Oh, I forgot to say superhumanization and dehumanization. Oh, well.
We'll open it up to questions.
I have a question that's for Bryan, but it's actually very much kind of reflected by some of the specific languages and moves that you're making, Sarah, in terms of this sort of appropriate, inappropriate response. And I'm thinking a lot about sort of Tommy Curry's work about having this really robust history, especially in America, of self-defense. And how self-defense is always already secondary to the moral imperative that we are going to invest in a more sort of Taoist, you can hurt me, but I can't hurt you, non-violence sort of investment. And I'm curious, just based on some of the work that you were doing in the archive, were there moments where you came across sort of a reflection about, like, are we Stokely Carmichael in this school? Are we MLK in this school? Is it Ida B. Wells's every Black folk should have a Bible and a Remington, or is this we hurt ourselves by hurting others? And I'm just kind of curious if you had come across any of those reflections.
So in this particular archive, no, right? The archive that I saw was like squarely focused, or rather the parts of the archive that I was looking at was sort of squarely focused on schools. I will say, however, two things. If you are Black and you're living in South Carolina in the 20th century, you know how to use a gun, right? And then also, while I agree that the discourse around the civil rights movement is wrapped in nonviolence, the beacons of defense in the Deep South were very important to moving mobilization forward. And when King went to Chicago, it was a gang that was protecting him, right? So as much as the politics and nonviolence within the civil rights movement is sort of the driving theory, self-defense is always there, and the employment of violence for even towards the employment of nonviolent political mobilization is always a tool that's always present. So no, I didn't see it in the archive, but like these guys all had those. Yeah.
Questions. You guys don't have questions.
So
Patrick, please.
just a couple of scattered things. Brian, the slide that had the picture of the van. And this is gonna seem like a silly little tangential thing for a second, but it looked like a VW van. Do you know what kind of van? And the reason I ask is because of the interesting history of VW as having been, Volkswagen, right? This is sort of a Nazi product, which then gets repurposed as the people's car and all kinds of, there's something interesting here about the appropriation, the material appropriation of objects. And that's part of the reason I look at that, it's like I recognize that model of van, because like we had one. Because that was my parents used to drive us around in, like that kind of van. So I'm curious about that, sort of and opens up sort of broader question of legacies and like what they're drawing. And so I wonder, the actual question that comes out of this is, in the archive, do you see the folks who are doing these freedom schools drawing on past precedent? Or is the Highlander Folk School kind of de novo, right? Is this something that's kind of like, because obviously it has sort of thematic parallels and structural parallels to other kinds of like people's education movements, but I wonder if this was a strategic reinvention in a particular thing, or were they like consciously inspired by and deliberately inspired by other kinds of examples? I'm just wondering if you see that kind of broader context, sort of educational context in what it is that you're seeing.
That's an excellent question. Before you asked that question, I would have said that the Highlander School is sort of the initial germination of this idea. But now that it's coming out of my mouth, that sounds completely inaccurate, right? Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a great question.
Because I was really struck when two or three are gathered. I'm like, yeah, all right. On the other hand, there's a long tradition of two or three again. So I'm kind of wondering like where the sort of the antecedents and roots of this.
I mean, I think it's impossible that they're not drawing on like religious traditions. It's impossible they're not drawing. I mean, these are the descendants of like Jimmy Cato and Denmark Vesey and the Combahee River Raid, right? Like there's a long history of activism in this particular community. That even before their engagement with the Highlander School, that they're able to draw, that they're sort of building organizations and movements around. But the ways in which Robinson in particular described it in the text that I saw, both the speeches that I most presented from, and even in sort of like the notes and scattered notes that she did, the messages she's sending individual people, that the introduction of the Highlander model was critically important to sort of initiating that mobilization. But I think it would be wholly inaccurate to say that without that germination, there's no sort of like structure, there's no sort of stratification that sort of allows that. They have to be drawing on a whole sort of, if for no other reason than as talented as Miles Quigley, his colleagues were, they have no idea of how Black folks in Johns Island, need to be communicated with or organized, so on and so forth. But that's definitely something we're continuing to explore as I sort of dig through this. So thanks.
Yeah, and if I can kind of pivot on that to a question for Sarah, because I was struck by one of the comments you made, which is a little bit peripheral to the argument, but I think is really an important thing. How hard it is to depict slow violence. How hard it is to depict slow violence.
Oh, yeah.
As opposed to cinematic big violence.
Yeah.
The planet blew up. Right, so we can get this. So there's this sort of cinematic, visceral kind of thing, a lot easier to dramatize, a lot easier to compress the time frame, and so on and so forth. And I really appreciated your pointing out that, of course, what Star Wars does, but some of these other franchises don't do, is it does talk about like political and social conditions needed to actually do that, right? So that you actually need the destruction of representative government in order to be able to have the kind of destruction of all road. But it occurs to me, of course, that the timing here matters because sci-fi is sci-fi fantasy, very intertextual kinds of genres. I was trying to think after you said that of a good depiction in sort of a sci-fi or fantasy universe of slow violence, and I couldn't think of one. And I'm curious. I mean, maybe some of Kim Stanley Robinson stuff comes closest. But I don't know. Do you know of a good example of sort of that doesn't sort of succumb to the cinematic temptation of let's blow up the planet?
My first go-to actually would be The Expanse, and sort of how we see Earth as run by the UN and the idea of like basic income, and like Earth is dirty, polluted, like Avasarala's house is like this sort of oasis in comparison to what we see of Baltimore and New York. Right. So I do think that you see this sort of, and that you do have the link between what Earth has become with colonization and the like extractiveness that's going on in the belt, and that you do have that sort of like environmental irresponsibility and that decay directly affecting politics in the belt and what's going on Mars. So I do think you see that, and but you also have five seasons? You have 5 seasons to work through with that. It's implied, it is implied in Andor. So on Cassian's home planet, obviously we see the strip mining, and like, you know, obviously deeply extractive, but it is mining, right? That's not Cloud City mining. Cloud City, right? It's portrayed very differently. But it's also implied with Aldani, right? The commander of the base is talking about how they're gonna keep building out and that sort of thing, and basically eliminate, you know, this incredibly important, like, this indigenous site. Right, but there's more agency and intentionality to that than the way it's portrayed in The Expanse, for example.
But I wonder, sort of ripping on that, I wonder about the kind of short-term temporality of some of these big things and the questions of mobilization, right? Because it's a lot harder, like with climate change, right? It's a lot harder to mobilize with climate change because it's like it's slow, we don't really sort of see its effect, but like, oh, they murdered these people, like that, you can sort of get people out of the street. So there's something about the temporality of mobilization, they also be kind of showing up there. And then just one sort of geeky canon footnote. No, we never see Leia break down the screen.
No.
We certainly do in the comics. Like,
interesting,
because there's a the whole Leia special series is her dealing with other survivors of Alderaan, and there's a lot of breaking down that goes on, and they all collectively process their trauma. Or they are, not trauma, grief.
I mean, it can be both. Like, look, it's Leia viewing the destruction of Alderaan is a traumatic event. But that can be distinct from experiences of grief, and then you have the collective grief. I think it's actually interesting that it's addressed in the comics, but not in the sort of texts that most people access, right? And that you see this pattern across specifically women-identified characters, where it's like you have the steadfastness, they don't break down. You could do a whole thing about like women military organizations, like that sort of thing, and you know what that could anchor, but it does hold in like the text that most people see. For the comics, I'm curious what it actually says about the understanding of that audience and what they want from the lore, and also what they're willing to accept being presented to them, which I sort of wonder what the text that I've discussed today, what the boundaries they imply for what we can talk about in like broad, Disney society. It's yeah.
Okay, well then I'll ask a question for both of you. Brian, I think the way that you, sort of framed this right is when 2 to 3 rebels gather, a freedom school is born. And I think to maybe connect to Sarah's, right, and thinking, I think about the gender specifically, right? So we don't see the women grieve. And is that because that's a sort of learned behavior that happens in small group settings where they learn I can't be a sort of leader if I grieve, right? And if we could sort of narrate an off-camera scene between Leia, Mon Mothma, and Vel, what might that look like, right? And for Brian, how are women maybe able to take advantage of opportunities that their gender lets them, sort of like the spaces that they can pass through that maybe a man couldn't, right? So like, how are women learning in maybe these small groups the sort of appropriate and inappropriate responses, actions, and behavior? So maybe you can play with gender a little bit.
I need to think first.
I do think what we see with Leia and Mon Mothma in particular is the burden of responsibility. They don't feel that they have the option of breaking down, and like Luke and Wilman aren't even thinking in those terms. Right, like it is more visceral, whereas you're seeing 2 women who are coded as being very, very privileged, from 2 of the origin worlds of the rebellion, and actually even more so than that, like they don't like those first few days of A New Hope, like that is, and I don't know the comics, so correct me if I'm wrong, but that's sort of her first experience with like the kinetics of all of this. It's her adoptive father has been funding the rebellion and going out and finding Jedi and seeding rebel cells, but like, and she obviously knows how to fire a weapon, but she's wearing all white, her boots aren't dirty. And Mothma doesn't really get dirty until she has to walk away from this conversation with Luthen, knowing that her childhood friend is about to be assassinated. Right? So I think that you see the intersection of class. In Star Wars, it would be species, but they are portrayed as white women. So class and where their positions have been in the rebellion. Like Leia's like, I'm a diplomat. Like she sort of tries to Karen Lord Vader, right? In a way, she's like, I'm on a diplomatic mission from Alderaan. And of course she should do that in the terms of like moving through spaces. Yeah, absolutely. But like her indignance in that moment is not something that like Bix isn't ever going to speak like that. Right. And that's interesting. So I think, but I also think that that comes in with like, how is refinement interacting with responsibility or feelings of responsibility interacting with like, they are now in a military apparatus and they're operating in a hierarchy that is not actually the hierarchy they've come up in. And they are brought into it. And I do think that there's like, they have to appear competent and they're both competent. I would say Mothma is coded as being far more competent than Leia in a lot of ways. Right. But they're very appearance conscious. Right. And I think that's worth thinking about in a way like Willman isn't, Cassian isn't, Lucas.
And I just two finger on that for just 1 second, because I know you don't want to like talk about sequels. But other, but I have to keep bringing up The Last Jedi because I still think it's one of the most profound Star Wars films that have been produced. Admiral Holdo, right? When Holdo, because Holdo is dressed in this flowy purple thing, right? And since the whole film, well, not the whole film, but important parts of that film are a meditation on the limitations of toxic masculinity, right? And it's like, okay, so the Bravo boy who's going to go out and save the day almost destroys the entire Rebel Alliance, right? What's not Rebel Alliance, Resistance, because like the Poe's plan is not the wrong plan. We're not supposed to do that, right? And Holdo comes across as someone who frustrates the expectations of the males. And it's like, oh, is that Admiral Holdo? Wow, that's not what I expected, Poe says at one point, right? So it's like, there's some, and at the moment when she knows that Leia, when Leia knows she's gonna die, when she stays on the ship, and they have a moment, right? As you taught me to say this, and you can see it in their faces. Like there's an acknowledgement of the grief. Like, I'm going to die now, I'm gonna stay on the ship, and I'm gonna pilot this, and I'm gonna die. So there is this moment of acknowledgement. I have a hard time imagining Star Wars depicting that moment between two men. Right? It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And for the other thing, you don't want to talk about prequels.
I know what I like.
The female character who we see breaking down on screen is Todd.
Yes,
like
it is.
In melodramatic, like but we see her, like, especially in Revenge of the Sith, like she's just a weepy mess, like most of the film.
I mean, that's what makes it unwatchable for me personally. I'm like, I actually can't stand this character. But I did just try to watch Attack of the Clones, and it actually opens with her body double being murdered, and she's like upset about it, but she doesn't break down like Revenge of the Sith Padme. No, she doesn't. They're like, you have to go vote. You have a responsibility, and she pulls it together, and she goes out and she's like, I can take this.
Yes.
So, like, interesting exploration can be had there of like what Anakin does to Padme.
Yeah.
Brian, a chance to respond to that question.
Yeah. Listening and not thinking about it. My first thought is that, especially in this era, teaching is gender dwarfed. So there's an opportunity both for agency and leadership for women as teachers that isn't really present for them in a lot of other situations, even within, like, again, family dynamic, within sort of the church dynamic, that kind of opportunity for leadership isn't really present. I had another thought around like, it's gone, it'll come back to me, but ask me the question again after. That's, yeah. That was a great.
Just real quick, because, Sarah, when you were giving your presentation, one of the quotations I had written down myself was actually from Patton. And, I think or no, it might be the third. Because there's this sort of kind of like, I think now, kind of this meta discursive, like mourning about the fall of democracy. And she does have that line where she's like, so this is how the republic dies, the thunderous applause, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
there is that kind of, I think, like a certain kind of grief or mourning, that it isn't just sort of an outside entity that destroys democracy or freedom and liberty. It's just as much our own complacency and fear and disconnection and selfishness, and it brews from within, and there's almost a decision to kind of walk toward that sort of authoritarian and yeah, and that's interesting, but yeah.
All right, well, thank you to both of our presenters.
Thank you.
Okay.